need to link the emergency managers with the academic. Unfortunately, a lot of the academic community does a lot of great research. There's a lot of great work out there. It doesn't get to the emergency manager. We don't receive those reports. We don't see them. Or we see them, they're in a language that we can't read. Most of us don't have the ability to understand because it's too scientific. I mean, I didn't do too good in physics and chemistry. Sorry, I became a social scientist in a way. So to me, looking at long formulas that's very nice, and I believe you. I'll let other academics check on what you. Just tell me what it means for me. Put it in a language that I can use something. And I appreciate the work, and I strongly encourage the work of the academics. We need it. We need to understand it. There needs to be more research. But if you want me to do something about it, you need to translate it. You need to put it in a way that I can read it, I can understand, I can do something with it.
I've appreciated the discussion this morning, particularly in regards to communicating risk and communicating that type of urgency. Students, even in elementary school, now get the analogy of the frog in the beaker, and that heat is being slowly turned up. They will just stay in there until it boils. But of course, a frog would immediately jump out of boiling water. We are like that, and as a species, I think, even though we're warm-blooded. And for some reason, the impact that Toronto had, that eureka moment, it seems very difficult for us to translate that to any other jurisdiction. Kamloops is equally threatened. Kamloops has elderly people with cardiovascular disease, but they are not able to translate the experience of Toronto. And so that, for public health, is a social marketing issue, I believe. And I'm curious, others' success, beyond the Toronto success, in trying to translate another jurisdiction's experience to make it real enough so they have the eureka moment without having to go through what Toronto had to go through.
Taking some evidence from the Latin American case, which isn't necessarily true, but when Alain said at the end that he goes to the public works office to tell them about this, the immediate question when asked is, why didn't the public works office ask that question themselves? And this relates to a fact which is very clear. In Latin America, we've attempted to dissuade municipalities and sectors to create a risk management unit within their organization, because we see that this is a cross-transverse problem, and in assigning it to one unit, everybody else thinks that unit will do it. When we realize the complexity of the risk situation and the adaptation thing in particular, when it's set up as three different things. Adaptation is response if you don't get rid of a risk, it is dealing with existing risk, and it is foreseeing future risk through better investment opportunities. In the first case, it is traditional emergency disaster management organizations. In the second case, it is public works, education, and a series of other types of institutions. And in the third case, it's ministries of finance, ministries of planning, who are planning new project cycles and trying to build it into the whole planning procedure. And I mention this because when you talk about jurisdiction, one of our major problems has been trying to get development-based organizations on board with risk and disaster management, etc., because they see it as being somebody else's problem, because we have set up disaster as being response and emergency management, and it isn't. Risk is a social, economic, political problem. It is constructed on the ground through decisions, investment decisions, bad decisions, unfortunate decisions. No?
As someone who's been doing work on looking at the interaction between climate and extreme cold in British Columbia and Canada for the last nearly 20 years, we often end up in situations, and I'm going to reflect on one as opposed to many of them, but there are many. I was at a meeting about 18 months ago in Seychelles, and I was talking about my research on how coastal rivers are changing, and used two examples from their community. And at the end of my talk, I had people come up to me and say, well, that's very interesting, but you need to do that on my river. You need to do that on the watershed I live in. And I think the issue in here, and I'm going to step way outside my normal limits, So, you know what, as a scientist, you're trained to conceptualize and build statistical and other kinds of models that you apply in a general sense. And so I go into a meeting like that expecting that if I tell somebody, here's 2, 3, 4 cases in your area, that this is what's going on, that they're going to get a message that this is what's happening everywhere. And I'm afraid what is really going on is they're taking that as anecdotal information that that's interesting over here and it's interesting over there, but it's not the general case. Now, I think that that's really part of the social marketing thing that my colleague back here is so involved with. But how are we going, I mean, is it an issue for the scientists who is really speaking in generalities, but it's not being heard in generalities, or is it something we need, you know, where's the tipping point in that? Where do we need to address making that happen?
And so what we ended up with was 3 days notice to 2 communities that they were potentially at risk of losing their power, but gave them some time to do something with it. And then it happened. We lost the line. And it was only gone for 2 days. I was really impressed with the amount of time it took us to restring those lines and get them back up. That was 2 days in a very hot spell in southern interior British Columbia. It allowed for them to make their plans in place, and ultimately the response back from all the politicians was, well done. We were able to make some use of that. So that was a positive learning for BC Hydro, to be able to let go of a little bit of information, and BCTC as well, because they're our transmission partner, and communicate out in advance and really see what the benefit of that was.
I think that really what worries me in those surveys that indicate that only 15% of the people associate loss of service with hazardous weather is that we haven't communicated the relationship. It's not as much as an issue of continuity of service. It's the fact that people, yes, they do expect to have the service, but they don't really associate the fact that hazardous weather will bring that kind of problem. And not only will it bring that kind of weather, there will be a lot of other hazards associated with it, like live lines on the road, floodings, all kinds of things that are coming together. And that's the preoccupation I have, because we haven't been able to communicate that message that there is an association between those things. There is a series of causal effects, a series of risk factors. There's not really a risk because we can't really quantify them from a proportion type of thing. There is no statistical formula by which we can give people even a degree of uncertainty.
Adaptive capacity of hydro, relying on larger fuel tanks for diesel generators, really brings up an issue of the conflict that often arises between adaptation and mitigation. So in a heat event, say one of a series of your transformers blows up in a lightning storm, and the demand for power is great, and you crank on a bunch of diesel generators for a few days, it can be devastating for people with asthma, cardiovascular disease, because those diesel generators are the dirtiest possible form of power that we have these days in North America. So I think we need to be careful as we plan for increased resiliency to make sure that as we do that, we're not exacerbating another problem by relying on a system that, yes, it might be fine if the wind is blowing nicely and getting all that pollution out of a mountain valley, but it could be deadly at 40 degrees C and a mountain valley with an inversion for 3 days.
People live on the Andreas Fault. People live on the edge of volcanoes. They know it's a risk. They think it's going to happen, down the line, not to me. It isn't enough that people know it's a risk. It's enough that people are persuaded that they've got to do something about it. And we just live in this kind of academic world where we think if we tell people who are at risk, they'll suddenly do something rational. They won't necessarily. We have to think a lot more about how it is we persuade people to act as opposed to just know something.